Welcome to Politics Indica and Chandran. Today's topic is titled Abbott Government's Refugee Policy Reaching Unprecedented Levels of Barbarism. What is the stand the Labour opposition and the High Court should take? And the importance of this topic cannot be overemphasized. And to speak on this topic, we have Dr. Lucy Fiske and Dr. Joyce Chia. Now, I'll introduce both the speakers and quickly, and then we can welcome them both the usual way. Now, Dr. Lucy Fiske is a Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. She previously held lectureships at the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University in Perth and at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at Sydney University, here in Sydney. Now, Lucy is interested in a wide range of human rights related topics with particular focus on refugees, asylum seekers and women's rights. Lucy's research has focused primarily on Australia's response to forced migration, attitudes that underpin national policy and discourse, racism and anti-racist education, immigration detention and refugee protests. So please join me in welcoming Lucy and Joyce the usual way.
Thank you very much for inviting me along today, and thank you, Chandra, in particular. You can get a job as a researcher. You've done your due diligence on both of our backgrounds. I'm afraid I have been somewhat recalcitrant, though, and I haven't addressed the topic very well, but hopefully it'll still be of interest. I thought that I would talk about the impact that Australia's refugee policies have on our near neighbours, and at least in the Southeast Asia region and somewhat beyond that, because in Australia, I think, or at least our government seems to think that it is that we are the centre of the world and that we are the only country that is impacted by irregular migration, and they're primarily interested in solving what they have created as a domestic political problem. And I say that they've created it because I liken it a bit like the cosmetics industry, that if you create a problem, then you can sell the solution. And I think that our government is doing that quite effectively. I don't see refugees coming here by boat as a problem. So the government is claiming that it is solving, and in fact in the last couple of days has almost declared victory in its problem with stopping the boats. But it's not actually solving any problems, and most particularly it's not solving the problems of refugees, and it's not solving the problems of our near neighbours. Chandra had said that most of my work is in Australia, but I've been getting increasingly interested in Indonesia, Malaysia and Thailand. I was in Bangkok last week, and I was lucky enough to go out and visit some refugee communities there. And Bangkok doesn't ordinarily have very many refugees living in the community. They've got a very large refugee population on the Thai-Burma border, but usually they only have around about 2,000 people at any given point in time living in Bangkok. That population in the last 12 months has grown fivefold. There are now slightly more than 10,000 refugees living there. And they're living there without any lawful status, and they have to be very, very careful not to get caught because, like Australia, Thailand detains people who are there without a valid visa, and there are only two ways out of detention, and that is to return to your country of origin or to be resettled onwards. The UNHCR in Bangkok is not equipped to deal with a fivefold increase in 12 months. And the UNHCR, both in Indonesia and Thailand, have both said that they are struggling for resources, particularly with the Syrian crisis and the very large number of new refugees being created there. It's meaning that the budgets for other offices are all getting reduced so that they can meet the needs of newly displaced Syrians. So the refugees that I spoke with had all been given dates for their refugee status determination interviews with UNHCR, which is the first step before any kind of resettlement can be considered. The earliest date for interviews is 2018. People need to live in the community without status for 4 years. And the people that I met said a number of their community members have actually returned to their country of origin because they know they're not going to be able to economically sustain themselves for that long. So they've gone back in the hope that they can then try again and try to get to Europe or somewhere else where they might get processed faster. But of those people who have stayed, there are a lot of family groups, and with children ranging in age from babies through to adulthood. And they're very, very worried about the education of their children during this time, that they're facing 4 to 6 or 8 years of having no education. But they've been quite ingenious, and they decided to survey their own community and find out what skills they have. And we were lucky enough to visit an underground school that was on the roof of an apartment building in outer Bangkok. And the local Thai people are supportive and sympathetic of them, and have agreed they act as guards at the base of the building so that if police come, they won't let them in. And everyone's pulled little bits of money so that they can pay the necessary bribes. And on the rooftop, they've got mats laid down, and they've tried to group children into different age groups, and they're delivering an education as best they can. And the organisers of the school said that they're having to try to shift their expectations away from the idea of certification or qualification towards education. And so they're saying they still want their children to be learning, and they want their children to stay emotionally well during this long wait ahead of them. The other place that I've spent a bit of time is Indonesia, and Indonesia typically is a transit country, so there's a small community of refugees who do stay there, but generally it's a transit country en route to Australia. And I've met quite a significant number of people there who arrived in Indonesia expecting that they would need to sustain themselves for somewhere between a few weeks to a few months before they could organise onward travel. And that travel is no longer possible for them, but their funds are running out. And there are so many people in this position in Indonesia that they've now been turning up to Indonesian authorities and asking to be taken into detention. And particularly it's Afghan Hazaras that are, and Pakistani Hazaras who are waiting in Indonesia. And returning home and trying again is simply not an option for that community. So Indonesia's detention centres are now so full that Indonesian authorities are turning people away. So people are facing destitution, and it's unclear how they're going to be able to survive. And it means also that their families who are in places like Quetta and Peshawar on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where making a living is very, very difficult and it's a very dangerous place, are actually sending remittances to their family members in Southeast Asia, when the plan had been pool your resources and the remittances will go the other way. So it's having quite an impact. It's also having an impact on community services in Indonesia. Indonesia is a country, its economy is growing rapidly. It's historically been, or had a large number of its population living in poverty. There's still roughly 50% of the population lives on the global poverty line or below, which is US $2 a day. So the Indonesian government has no appetite for detention. It's under pressure from the Australian government to detain people, and Australia largely funds detention operations in Indonesia. And Indonesia doesn't refool people, so it won't, once someone has registered with the UNHCR, they don't deport people to a situation where they might be in danger. But what they won't do is allow refugees to compete with local Indonesians for making a livelihood. So refugees are not able to work, and they're not able to start small enterprises, perhaps selling things on the street. So people are increasingly getting forced into destitution. And there are very few social services there that do work with refugees. Church World Service and Jesuit Refugee Services are two that do. And Jesuit Refugee Services are finding that they are increasingly having to say no to people, that they can't help them. So there's quite an unmitigated disaster building in our northern neighbours. When I was in Bangkok also, and I'll just keep an eye on the time, because I have been known to go on a little, I visited a place called the Regional Support Office. Now that's an office that's been set up, some of you may have heard about the Bali process and something called the Regional Cooperation Framework. So our government has been talking about establishing regional cooperation, and they are funding something called the Regional Support Office, which is meant to be coordinating and operationalising a regional cooperation framework. But it is all about criminalising irregular migration. And the first project that the Regional Support Office has done is to set out a blueprint for how countries in the region can draft laws that make the crossing of borders a criminal offence. And certainly the discourse there is all about border security, stopping people from crossing borders, and once people have crossed borders, helping them to return back to where they've come. Now, if you're a Rohingya who has escaped out of Burma, I'm really not very sure how much help you want to get back into Burma. There was no talk of protection whatsoever. The next project that they are doing, and Australia and Sri Lanka are taking a joint lead on it, and that's mapping embarkation points on the Indonesian coastline. So they're trying to map where people arrive and depart from, so that they can better plan services. And I dread to think what services they might be. Now, I have travelled a lot this year, I don't always, but I was at another conference in the UK in March, and a former senior UNHCR policy officer spoke, and he said that the numbers that Australia gets is not that big globally, but that he sees Australia as a very, very important site globally. He said that as much as refugee supporters are watching what our government is doing, so too are other governments. And he was very fearful that if the Australian government gets away with the policies that it's implementing, that it could have dire consequences for the Refugee Convention and the protection of refugees worldwide. And he was urging us to fight hard. He was urging the UNHCR to fight hard because we're setting very, very dire and dangerous precedents. And that was before the interception of the 2 boats carrying Sri Lankan asylum seekers and the return of one. So I can only imagine what he might think now. So just to give a brief nod to the brief of what I was meant to talk about what Labor in the High Court should do. I don't know what they should do. I'm not a political scientist, but I would like Labor to have a good long hard look at itself, and Labor members to have a good think about what sort of world we want to live in. And to not think of ourselves as quite as isolated as we sometimes do, or to think that we're the only country that receives refugees without authorisation, whether by boat or air or land or any other mode of transport. And to reaffirm, have a think about history, have a think about why we have a Refugees Convention, have a think about why we have any kind of commitment to human rights whatsoever, and to reaffirm the value base that underpins it, and have our policies begin to emanate from there. Thank you.